I'm Josie Long, writer, stand-up comedian and museum enthusiast. We're looking at the Museum of the Home, a Grade 1 listed former arms house on Kingsland Road in Shoreditch, London. Join us as we discover the hidden gems of this collection through the staff and volunteers who share their favourite artworks and personal picks.
There's Martin Parr-esque humour to it, but there's also something deeply empathetic.
The front room is about marking off the street, and the street is a vulgar place.
This tree trunk was a water pipe, bringing drinking water into the homes of wealthy Londoners.
Let's explore stories from the Museum of the Home, London.
My name's Sonia Solikari and I'm Director of the Museum of the Home. We tell the history of the home from the 1600s to the present day, but that history is also a history of thought and feeling as well as bricks and mortar. So we're really interested in that wide and expansive idea of home. We really want to know how things are experienced. So it's not just the history of design and how that has changed over time, although we are interested in that. It's like, what is people's lived experience of that armchair? We've got some on display, absolutely, incredible chairs from the 20th century, really kind of conceptual. But did people find it comfortable? It looks like you'd need to be hauled out of it with two arms. There's no way of getting out of those chairs with dignity.
It's the everyday, small ephemera of life, and it is the very depths of belonging and identity as well.
Our rooms through time as they are at the moment, they were done a couple of decades ago, and they're our next big project, because we're really looking to see what is the role of the room set in the 21st century museum, rather than it being put together by a group of curators based on historical records. Michael's room, that was a very different approach for us as a museum, because that was very much his memory space, and that's a different way of putting together a room.
My name is Michael Macmillan. I am a writer, artist, curator. Both my parents are from the Caribbean. I'm born here in the UK. And this was the front room. This was where we weren't really allowed as children unless there were guests.
The good room.
The special room.
It showcases a particular time.
Yeah.
And it showcases a particular window on culture.
Yeah. It's where the family wants to represent who they are to the outsider. But it's contradictory. It's also about a kind of gendered respectability which is put on women. Which is quite oppressive in a way. It's quite patriarchal in a way. Even though it's my mother's room that she dressed, it was my dad who used it mainly to entertain. And now the object I wanted to talk about would be the radiogram. So it's a phono turntable and radio housed in a veneer wooden cabinet. It was significant because you found people from the Windrush generation, even up into the 70s, weren't often welcome in pubs and clubs. This appliance was where the first house parties and some of the blues parties began.
What I love about examining the objects is the amount of detail that comes out of them beyond the object itself.
And we could talk about the crochet. The crochet is so important because that was originally brought by European missionaries to places like the Caribbean, and then they refashioned it. Crochet is not the thing that displayed. Crochet offsets anything that's put onto it. There's also a black scroll, a kind of souvenir kitsch scroll. But on it had the island of St. Vincent, which is where my parents came from. And this was important because at school, I didn't learn anything about Caribbean history or much less St. Vincent. And that was where my family originates from. The item next to the radiogram is the drinks cabinet. And the only function is to display things you never really used.
Sure.
The room is about impression management. You come into the room and you're impressed. Well, it's doing its job.
And I love how it's almost like aggressively not minimalist.
Yes.
It feels really living as a space, even if it is still the formal space.
That's right. And of course, the front room emanates from the Victorian parlour. It's all about respectability. And the Victorians were, in a sense, the first hoarders. They collected everything from the empire.
Yeah.
Interestingly, in the rooms through time, the only other room that is similar to the front room is the Victorian room. It's just packed out with stuff.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Home is changing all the time, not just over the centuries, but in our own experiences. Relationships come up time and time again, and having companionship or loneliness can be absolutely key to somebody's feeling of home.
I'd also like to talk about this object that you've chosen because it's such an instant feeling of like nostalgia for me to look at it. Tell me a bit about what we're looking at.
So we're looking at a tomato red dial telephone, and these are really popular in the 1970s, and then by the 80s it started to decline as cell phones started to come in. The fact that it was often a fixed thing as opposed to a mobile thing was absolutely crucial to our experience of having conversations in the home, and the idea and the striving for privacy, because it's very difficult if it's in the hall space and like you've got to like shut the door to the living room or whatever.
No, I have such a vivid memory of my parents overhearing me speaking to my friend when I was 13 and getting in trouble, not realising they'd overheard.
The history of the teenager in the home is super interesting too, because technological advances change behaviours in lots of ways. Teenagers started to gain privacy in a sense of their own space with things like central heating, which meant that everyone didn't have to crowd in the one heated room in the home, and people could go up into bedrooms or other spaces in the home and hang out there. The dial phone is just a moment in that constant striving towards having less and less parental surveillance.
Everybody always says, what's the best time to come see the gardens? Any time, because there's always something to see. I've been head gardener now for the last 26 years at the Museum of the Home.
Hi Heather, it's nice to meet you.
And you. The whole idea of the gardens was to relate to the rooms inside. You can actually see them from inside as well.
Let's talk about your object, and I understand that you picked rosemary. Why did you choose this particular plant?
It's the very first plant I actually saw when I first started working here, when I walked into the water herb garden. And something I've always done, if anybody's left the museum, I've always done a bouquet of flowers up for them. And I've always put a rosemary in it because of remembrance.
Oh, I've got facts about rosemary in my notes, and it says that it genuinely is really good for your memory, but also it's got loads of uses in terms of it's a medicinal herb as well.
And you can use it to make a dye as well.
I'm really worried I'm going to sound stupid. It's a green dye.
So it kind of comes out like a yellowy greenish colour. Also, it was supposed to like Christmas tree, you could decorate it.
Wow, that's what people used as the first Christmas tree. Yeah, that makes loads of sense. And then it's more useful than a fir tree because you can just put it on the lamb afterwards.
Roast potatoes.
I'm Louis Plattman. I'm assistant curator at the Museum of the Home.
The object that you've chosen, I feel like I need a lot of information about what we're looking at because I really have no idea what it could be.
Yeah, well, that's what drew me to it. There was a water pipe, and the New River is a canal built as a way of bringing clean drinking water into the homes of wealthy Londoners. And spanning from the New River were miles and miles of wooden pipes made out of whole elm tree trunks, slotted one end into the other. It was a huge network and lasted for over 200 years.
Wow, the idea of wood being used as water pipes doesn't feel right to me. It feels like it'll rot, but it lasted for 200 years.
It wasn't the most reliable. The wood did rot, and if, say, an animal died in the soil nearby, that putrid water might leak into the system. But it was the best they could do.
And I can see that there's a painting of a public water fountain.
Yeah, so this shows how poor people, or the more general population, would have got their clean drinking water via charitable organisations. Otherwise, you'd have to collect rainwater, drink dirty water, drink lots of alcohol, or there are even water sellers called cobs that would go around the street and sell you reasonably fresh bucket water.
Quite, it wasn't just the case that you didn't have the convenience, it was the case of you didn't have the sustenance.
I guess as fresh water becomes more and more scarce, it may return to not being an automatic privilege.
Oh, it's a cheering thought. It's a cheering thought. Well, and also, I mean, what it says is these fundamentals have such a great effect on home life and quality of life, and it's sort of how we think of ourselves in modern times is like all these things that we just assume are kind of basics.
I'm Callum Perrin, artist in residence. In kind of artistic research, you don't know what's going to leave an impression on you and then what's going to leave an impression on your work. It's so different to like academic research.
What kinds of things have you sort of unearthed?
I've become more interested in like the body in the domestic space. This is a series of photographs of the Ethelberger Tower in Battersea. They are architecturally identical spaces, but each photograph has a completely different feeling to it that reflects this sort of different lives that have been led in these rooms.
It's so funny, it's almost like a controlled experiment, isn't it? Each person is so completely different. It feels a bit uncanny.
Yeah, oh yeah. It feels very, very familiar, but everything feels a little bit off. That is the thing that I really love. That's my favourite thing about this photographic series. It's like the uncanniness of visiting someone else's domestic space.
Yes.
There's something of that kind of deadpan, Martin Parr-esque humour to it, but there's also something deeply empathetic.
There's a quote that I've got here from the artist where he says, I was curious to see what other people had done with their flats because Mark Cowper has lived on and off in Ethelberger Tower in Battersea, South London, for 20 years. And he says, it's fascinating how much self-expression can go into one small space. And everyone likes to peek into someone else's world, don't they?
And also like seeing someone in their domestic space is a way to see them in their most natural environment.
Their natural habitat.
Yeah, it literally is. And like the way that people move and act is different in those spaces. The majority of people who've had their photographs taken were also like asked to fill out a questionnaire about their like daily life and their space. And it's super interesting. Sometimes the way that people think about their own space is so different to what you actually see.
Historically, tower blocks have been demonised and deprived. Even though they came from really utopian roots, that vision wasn't then nurtured. And so a piece like this is really beautiful because it does sort of give voice to people that perhaps otherwise are just spoken for. I would love to know what you think people's homes will look like in the future. Like, what do you imagine people's homes reflecting?
The questions that people are asking more and more is, is communal living the future? Certainly it goes hand in hand with environmental concerns as well.
And I suppose thinking about it through the lens of community and adding social aspects to life that have been taken away through the pretense of convenience is actually a better way of looking at it.
We know that change is possible because of the changes that happened during COVID. We saw the return of the 15-minute city, for example, so people doing everything super locally. We've seen fundamental shifts in behaviours, so we know that they're possible now. That kind of opens up opportunity.